Welcome, everyone, to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and last time Burnside invaded East Tennessee, defeated James Longstreet, and then left the region to return home. Now he gets his next assignment. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, or purchase something from a Teespring store or Etsy shop. Every little bit helps. Thank you. Burnside spent the holidays in Rhode Island, throwing a little New Year's Eve party to welcome in the new year, 1864. But he wouldn't remain idle. After the festivities, he packed his things and left for Washington to get his next assignment. The War Department contemplated him for a couple of positions, one of them being sending him to Missouri, a volatile area that Abraham Lincoln and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton believed would benefit from Burnside's administrative abilities. But Burnside wanted a field command. He never liked being solely responsible for an army, and would much rather use a smaller command in a subordinate role. Lincoln and Stanton contemplated sending him back to East Tennessee, but that position went to John M. Schofield. Ultimately, Burnside was ordered by the War Department to restore the ranks of the Ninth Corps for a special assignment. They wanted Burnside to increase the Ninth Corps to 50,000 men and sent him on recruitment duty. However, there was a catch. He could only recruit from New England, New York, Pennsylvania, and Michigan for new troops, but the regiments from states like Ohio that were already in the Ninth Corps could recruit to build up their own ranks within their respective states. With the Ninth Corps consisting of about 5,000 men, that meant Burnside needed to recruit around 45,000 troops for the Corps. To help his recruitment efforts, Burnside asked to be allowed to create a division entirely made up of African American recruits. This was a complete change in Burnside. When Burnside first entered Kentucky and was told he could recruit African American men into his ranks, he balked at the thought because he was afraid it would alienate the potential white recruits and cause more problems during the 1863 draft riots. Now he gladly recruited black men for his Ninth Corps. He did have an adversary, though. Winfield Scott Hancock, recovering from his wound at Gettysburg, was also in New York and other northeastern states to recruit for his Second Corps. The two staffs butted heads repeatedly as they vied for the same men to join their respective corps, but Burnside himself stayed out of the conflict. In Washington, Burnside met with the newly promoted Ulysses S. Grant, who now held the rank of lieutenant general and controlled all Union forces. Burnside convinced Grant to give him his Ninth Corps troops from East Tennessee. After the meeting, Burnside traveled by rail east to Chicago and other Midwestern towns, attempting to fill the ranks of his Ninth Corps regiments. He met with governors of those states, like he did with the governors of New England states, speaking patriotically to audiences. Burnside hoped to be sent back to North Carolina to attack the Weldon Railroad and/or Wilmington. He said as much in a dispatch to Stanton, but Grant had other plans for Burnside and the Ninth Corps. Those troops were already forming in Annapolis, Maryland, prepared to go wherever they were summoned. Burnside didn't know it yet, but Grant planned to use the Ninth Corps in the upcoming campaign in Virginia against Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia in what would become known as the Overland Campaign. Grant came to view the Ninth Corps at Annapolis, but unlike when George McClellan as Army commander would visit, the men didn't don their white gloves and parade around for him. Grant formed them up and cantered back and forth viewing them. Then on April 23rd, Burnside and his corps broke camp. They marched away from the water, which meant they weren't going to North Carolina as many of them hoped. Burnside was leading them to Washington, D.C., where they marched in front of the White House and saluted Abraham Lincoln as they marched by. They crossed the Potomac River and proceeded into Virginia. The rank-and-file soldiers now knew what their assignment was. It was to engage with Robert E. Lee, someone they hadn't faced since December 1862 at the Battle of Fredericksburg. Grant kept Burnside and the Ninth Corps back, at least initially, out of respect to the Army of the Potomac commander George Meade, whom Burnside outranked. The Ninth Corps and Burnside would act independent of the Army of the Potomac under the direct orders of Grant. Burnside established his headquarters in Warrenton to watch over the supply base for the Army, but his and the Ninth Corps' presence made a stir in the Army. The first black troops the Army of the Potomac ever had came with Burnside. One of Burnside's biographers described the important moment. The sight of these armed black men represented the great transformation wrought by a war that had already changed many things and many men. Their presence in the Ninth Corps marked one of the men so changed, signifying as it did Burnside's final reevaluation of his pre-war politics. The democratic principles which allowed him to return fugitive slaves to loyal Tar Heels early in 1862 had given way beneath the larger burden of reunion by the end of that year. His pragmatic accommodation of racial sensitivities, evidenced by his reluctance even to enroll potential black conscripts in Kentucky in 1863, had now evolved into a remarkably egalitarian perspective. If emancipation were not yet a fact, he considered it inevitable, and once the slave was free, Burnside was ready to call him a man. George McClellan was not the only Democrat with whom he had broken. On May 4, 1864, the Army of the Potomac moved to slip by Robert E. Lee's right flank. The Ninth Corps was held back until troops from Washington could replace his men as guards on the railroad. Then the Ninth Corps followed the other three Union corps. On May 5th, Lee came into contact with Grant and Meade's army in a location called the Wilderness because of the entangled mess of underbrush and forest that occupied the area. It was incredibly difficult to move through, and the terrain gave Lee's inferior numbers a better chance against the Union juggernaut. The 2nd, 5th, and 6th Union Corps engaged, with Burnside's troops having to march the same distance to the battlefield in a fraction of the time. Burnside met with Meade, Grant, and the other corps commanders on the night of May 5th to plan the next day's assault. The 5th and 6th Corps were engaged with Richard Ewell's Confederate Corps on the Orange Turnpike. A few miles south, Winfield Scott Hancock and his 2nd Corps were engaging with A.P. Hill's Confederate Corps on the Orange Plank Road. Burnside was to bring his corps online in the center and connect the two halves of the Union Army. Grant wanted Burnside's corps to arrive in the early morning on May 6th, but the other corps commanders believed the march was too difficult and the terrain too unforgiving for Burnside to be in position at the time specified. Grant only delayed it half an hour, then sent the corps commanders away. By dawn the next morning, Burnside was only able to get one division to Hancock's left flank to attack. By that time, Hancock's men were already attacking and driving A.P. Hill's men back along the Orange Plank Road. When one of Meade's staffers came to Hancock and told him that Burnside's corps wasn't online yet, Hancock responded, "I knew it, just what I expected. If he could attack now, we would smash A.P. Hill to pieces." That seemed to be a derogatory statement aimed at Burnside, but as one of Burnside's biographers pointed out, the meeting the previous night demonstrated that the corps commanders believed the time Burnside was ordered to be ready wasn't feasible for him to get into position. Taken in that way, Hancock's statement is a statement directed toward Grant, meaning that he knew they hadn't given Burnside enough time to make his way to the scene of battle and place his divisions in the tangled wilderness. A combination of obstacles in the terrain, miscommunication between Meade and Grant's aides to Burnside, and some incompetence on the part of some subordinates in the Ninth Corps, Burnside wasn't able to land the decisive blow against Hill's men that Grant and Hancock anticipated. Nevertheless, Burnside groped through the wilderness, attempting to find Hill's left flank and to link up with Hancock's right flank. Burnside was able to relieve some of the pressure off of Hancock, but it wasn't enough to defeat the Confederates. Over the course of the next day, the two armies glared at one another, with only light skirmishing taking place. Grant decided to move his army further to the east and south to get around Lee's flank. Again, Burnside's troops guarded the rear, and his all-black division, under Edward Ferrero, was used to guard the wagon trains, denying Burnside the use of those troops. Unlike Burnside, many of the other Union generals believed that the only benefit of black troops were for guard duty and not for combat. Burnside and his corps arrived on the Union left flank at Spotsylvania courthouse, but didn't push too far against the Confederate defenders. It was lightly defended, but Burnside was concerned over Grant's orders. Grant told Burnside to halt his troops at a specific location, but that location wasn't on Burnside's map. Therefore, he didn't know if he had gone too far or hadn't gone far enough. As Burnside crossed the river in his front, he formed his men to assist in the upcoming attacks against the Confederate line at a salient called the Muleshoe. On May 10th, 12 Union regiments were formed and ordered to break the Confederate line, and Burnside was ordered to help divert Lee's attention away from the attack by hitting Lee in the right flank. Problems arose when one of Burnside's division commanders, Thomas Stevenson, was killed by a sharpshooter. His death greatly affected Burnside, and it threw any attack he was to make into confusion because the division was now taken over by Daniel Leisure, an incompetent commander. Burnside was so concerned over Leisure's abilities that he would take brigades from him and distribute them to his more trusted subordinates. Soon Leisure would be gone, and Thomas Crittenden, a Kentucky Unionist, would take over the division. Oddly enough, Crittenden outranked everyone on the field except for Burnside and Grant, so his placement under Burnside was understandable. On May 12th, Grant tried to break the Confederate line at the Muleshoe again, this time using the entire corps of Winfield Scott Hancock. He wanted Burnside to again attack Lee's right flank and even sent a personal aide, Cyrus Comstock, to stay with Burnside and make sure he did as he was asked. Hancock's attack was a success, at least initially. It drove back the Confederates, and the attack depended on Burnside's assistance to link up with Hancock's line and continue the push. Burnside's attack was slow, and even Burnside's biographers have a hard time defending his slow actions on May 12th. Comstock partially defended Burnside when some orders were changed at the last minute, and Burnside had to redirect the attack, but the half-hearted attacks yielded little results, except for one small breakthrough that was quickly sealed off and the Union troops thrown back. Grant at the time was becoming aggravated at Burnside and perceived him as being slow or timid, a belief he would hold until much later, when his opinion of Burnside softened. The Union Army of the Potomac wouldn't stay at Spotsylvania Courthouse long. Grant couldn't budge Lee from his defenses and decided to push south and east again, around Lee's right flank. As the Ninth Corps marched down the roads from the courthouse, Burnside found Grant and Meade at a Virginia woman's home. Burnside stopped, dismounted, and climbed the stairs. Before addressing Grant and Meade, he took off his hat to address the woman of the house. He asked her if she had seen so many Union soldiers before. She replied that she had, to the astonishment of Burnside. Then she said, in the prisons in Richmond. Meade and Grant's staff got a laugh out of the encounter. Pushing southward, the next location that Lee made a stand was at the North Anna River. As always, Burnside's corps was the rear guard, so he got to the battlefield last and worn out from the long march. Burnside's corps was spread out, with one division being placed under the command of Hancock on the Union left. Burnside was to guard and cross the river at Quarles Mill and Ox's Ford. Crittenden began crossing his men, but James Ledlie, one of Crittenden's brigade commanders, got drunk and led his men against the main Confederate line. Ledlie did nothing but get his men killed, weakening Burnside's corps and adding nothing to the fight. Ox's Ford was the most difficult location to cross the river, and it was at the apex of Lee's line, and it couldn't be crossed without significant loss of life. Grant decided to pull away from the river and again go around Lee's flank. Before he did so, he realized that Burnside's humility was genuine and officially assigned the Ninth Corps to the Army of the Potomac under the direct control of Meade. A little while later, Meade came to Burnside's headquarters accusing Burnside of not following orders by not securing the fords and inhibiting the Fifth Corps' movements. Burnside would admit if he was wrong, but in this case, Burnside was in the right and told Meade as such. Meade was informed of the error in his information, but didn't offer an apology to Burnside. The Army of the Potomac moved further east and south across the Pamunkey River and occupied an area between Bethesda Church and Cold Harbor. At the time, Burnside and Governor K. Warren's corps were on the Union right near Bethesda Church, but ordered to move to the left. When Burnside pulled his troops out and Warren pulled some of his troops out, the Confederates attacked. After a few tense moments, Warren and Burnside were able to throw back the attacks. Their movement, farther to the left, resulted in the Ninth Corps being a part of the mass assault and slaughter that Cold Harbor is known for. After the assault, Grant continued to maneuver his army, and Burnside and his corps were ordered to take the place of some Second Corps troops, as well as part of the 18th Corps under William Baldy Smith, Burnside's antagonist subordinate at Fredericksburg. When Smith removed his men without waiting for Burnside's troops to see if they could fill the gap, Burnside grew concerned and approached Smith about leaving some troops in place to guard the line in case of an attack. Smith told Burnside to take it up with the chief engineer, another man that didn't like Burnside, and had been the staffer for George McClellan, who misplaced the Ninth Corps troops at Antietam. Burnside was irritated at the way he and his corps were being treated in the Army of the Potomac and remarked that he was perfectly disgusted by other generals' actions. The next few days were pretty quiet except for a few shells from occasional artillery being fired into camp and the distant sound of skirmishing. Burnside took advantage of the time to read some New York papers. In one, he found an article disparaging the Ninth Corps. The author of the article was now following Grant's staff, with the promise that he wouldn't communicate with the paper while on campaign. He broke his promise, and worse, he came into Burnside's camp. Burnside immediately had him arrested as a spy and threatened to have him shot. It was all a bluff to scare the reporter, but it did take Grant to rescue the man. But upon finding out that the reporter had been communicating with his paper after all, Grant had him banished from the Army. It was now mid-June 1864, and the Army of the Potomac began to work its way south of Richmond to the town of Petersburg. The 18th, 2nd, and 9th Corps were chosen to attack the defenses of that town, with the 18th Corps under Smith only launching half-hearted attacks. When Hancock's 2nd Corps and Burnside's 9th Corps arrived on the field, it was getting late, but they attacked anyway. For the next 2 days, Burnside's men threw themselves against the entrenchments, attempting to dislodge the rebels. All 3 corps were placed under Hancock, even though both Smith and Burnside outranked him, but a coordinated effort to attack the earthworks around Petersburg ended in vain. Particularly hit was the 9th Corps. In the last days of the attacks, one of Burnside's divisions lost 50% of its men, bringing the entire division to just 1,000 men. A couple of things led to the failure by all 3 corps, but especially the 9th Corps in trying to take the works. For one, the constant fighting since early May resulted in few experienced officers at the head of regiments and brigades. For example, only 2 of Burnside's 7 brigade commanders were led by the same men that began the Overland Campaign, and some of the regiments were commanded by officers as low as captains. Another factor that resulted in the failed attacks was the fact that Burnside's corps contained some of the newest recruits, and even during the campaign, his reinforcements were men who had never seen combat. Some heavy artillery regiments turned into infantry for the campaign and refused to attack during those assaults at Petersburg. Burnside, exhausted after the attacks, laid under a tree at the 5th Corps headquarters, complaining of the heavy artillery units. The other corps commanders sympathized. Meade, although he had been harsh with Burnside earlier, thanked him and the 9th Corps for their superhuman actions during the fight for Petersburg. After reading Meade's congratulations, Burnside said, "He is irascible, but he is a magnanimous man." The army around Petersburg went into siege warfare, and quickly, one of Burnside's subordinates realized that their position lay close to the Confederate lines, which would allow them to dig a tunnel underneath the enemy lines. With a tunnel dug, they could explode black powder under the rebels and make them susceptible to an attack. Burnside gave it his blessing, even though Meade and others doubted whether it would work. For pretty much all of the Overland Campaign, Burnside's division of black soldiers under Edward Ferrero were held back, guarding wagon trains or digging earthworks for other corps. Burnside officially took back command of them, and since they had not endured the brutal attacks from the Wilderness to Cold Harbor, their ranks were fuller than the rest of the divisions of his corps. So he chose them to make the attack once the black powder explosion broke the Confederate line. For 2 weeks, while the Pennsylvania miners turned soldiers dug the tunnel underneath the Confederates, Ferrero trained his troops in what would be expected of them in the attack. During the advance, some of the regiments would break off and advance along the flank as guards to widen the breach and push back any Confederates in their way. When Burnside informed Meade that he had chosen Ferrero's black troops as the assault force, Meade balked at the thought, saying that he couldn't send those inexperienced troops into battle. Plus, he didn't want the flanking maneuver performed, deciding that the assault column needed to make a direct assault. Burnside had more faith in the African-American soldiers than the army commander. But now Burnside would need to choose another attacking force. He had 3 other divisions to choose from. James Ledley's division was the freshest, not having been on the front lines in a couple weeks, but his most dependable divisions were more shot up from the fighting across Virginia. After consulting with his generals, they couldn't decide who would lead the assault. Burnside put their 3 names in a hat, probably his own, and drew out a name. Ledley drew the odd lot, and his division would lead the attack with the other divisions coming up as needed. At 4:44 a.m. on July 30th, the explosion ripped through the Confederate earthworks, creating a massive crater in the rebel lines. 10 to 15 minutes went by before Ledley ordered his men forward, then he ducked into a bomb-proof. His men surged forward across no man's land, but instead of heading to the outside of the crater and going to the intact trenches, they went into the crater. Some units did fan out, but they were stopped by rebel soldiers who had formed up in time to push them back. The objective that Burnside pointed out to his division commanders was the area just beyond the crater, but that information wasn't passed down to the brigade commanders, or if it was, Ledley wasn't there to refocus the division, and or the troops weren't confident enough to leave the outskirts of the crater. Burnside sent in more of the 9th Corps, but the lack of aggression shown by Ledley's division allowed the Confederate commanders to organize resistance against the Corps. Finally, with not many options and the morning dragging on, Burnside ordered in Ferrero's division, citing Meade's orders, to use all of his force. The added weight of that extra division didn't help, because they too were in the crater. The Confederates described it as a turkey shoot as they formed around the crater and shot into the blue ranks. The Federal soldiers were so tightly packed that some men couldn't lift their arms. By this time, Meade arrived at the front to question Burnside. Meade was mad at the lack of information given to him about how the assault was going. Hearing a few reports, Meade told Burnside to order a withdrawal. This sent Burnside over the edge. For months he had endured condescension at the hands of other generals in the Army of the Potomac, and he finally lashed back, saying that if he had had the proper support from forces on his left and right, then it would be successful, and still could be. He petitioned to get Warren's 5th Corps to attack the undefended right flank of the rebels. The enemy had moved troops from that sector to deal with Burnside's attack, and the opportunity was now, while some of Burnside's troops held the rebel entrenchments. Burnside turned to 10th Corps Commander Edward Ord to assure Meade it would work if they threw in more troops. Ord just shook his head. With that, Meade told Burnside to order the withdrawal. Again, just like at Antietam, Burnside felt that victory was close had he been given proper support. Meade ordered a court of inquiry about the battle and charged Burnside with insubordination. The generals presiding over the court were anti-Burnside and pro-Meade, so Burnside could see the writing on the wall. Nevertheless, he defended his stance, citing Meade's orders against using flank guards and dismissing the use of the larger black division in performing the assault. Before the court presented its findings, Burnside had left the Army on a 20-day leave. He was happy to be away from the Army of the Potomac and its backbiting.